Welcome. My name is Suzanne Clary. I'm the president of the J. Heritage Center, and I'm delighted to see this very full and robust attendance for this very important and compelling conversation with Grant Ujifusa and Kim Roosevelt. This is a collaboration, a very recent collaboration, but very fruitful as well, a partnership with the Japan Society of Greater Fairfield County. And we have been delighted to work on a number of different programs, exhibits, and even an Ikebana show with them. And there is much more to come. This is a place of history. This is a place of discussion. It is not a stagnant historic landmark by any means. And so these kinds of conversations where we look at our past to inform our present are part of what we do on a regular basis. And so again, we're just so grateful to the Japan Society of Greater Fairfield County to take this step forward with us as we expand the kind of programming that we are doing. I hope you will come back for many more programs. We have another Ikebana event coming up. We have more events about paintings of Koho Yamamoto in the internment camps. But I know that the person to share more of these upcoming collaborations with you is Jackie Alexander, the president of the Japan Society of Greater Fairfield County, and a colleague and a good friend now. So, Jackie, I'd like you to take the podium.
Thank you, Suzanne. Don't lower it. Just did that. Well, it's President's Day tomorrow, February 19th. February 19th is also the anniversary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president, signing the Executive Order 9066 in 1942, which paved the way to incarcerate 120,000 lives of Japanese ancestry. 1/16 was the criteria, and 2/3 of them being American citizens. It is officially called the Day of Remembrance. So good afternoon, and thank you all for coming for this important event, and it's good to see a full room. I'm Jackie Alexander, president of the Japan Society of Greater Fairfield County. I first approached Suzanne looking for places to spread goodwill. I was looking for places to plant cherry blossom trees. Cherry blossom sakura are the harbinger of spring, the fragility, the fleeting blossom show beauty and a source of renewal. And its gift is often a symbol of friendship, as you see in Washington, D.C., and communities around the U.S. So the main mission of the Japan Society is to build community and mutual understanding between Japanese and Americans through educational, cultural, philanthropic programs. I looked at J Heritage Mission, and I saw a partnership beyond our gift of just 22 trees. So we've been doing these programs as we educate and we build our community together. On a personal side, I helped acquire the Sumie painting, ink painting. You could see the barracks, the American flag. It's done of the Topaz internment camp, one of the 10 incarceration sites during World War II, on the condition that it would be on loan here for a year at the J Heritage Center. And it's rare because Koho Yamamoto, who was a young 20-year-old at the time, going through Tanforan, then Topaz, then Tule Lake, was trained by the famous Chiro Obata, himself at the Topaz Art School. And it's rare because Topaz didn't have any of her pieces, because her known works, she was generous to donate to the Smithsonian and other museums. So after this year, the painting will go back, or go to, first time, to Delta, Utah, where the Topaz Museum is. And I encourage you all to go there. But it is in the middle of a desert-like scene, just like all the internment camps were. So this is a great opportunity to see it here. My own American story started with my grandfather coming to America in the 1890s. My father's two older and one younger sibling were all born in America. My father was born on the Japan side of the trips. So my father was born in Japan. That makes me a second-generation Nisei. But my roots started in the 1800s. And most were sent to Topaz, some other camps, my mother's side too. My father was sent to, had time in Ellis Island. Those who came before me had stories of survival, coming to this land of opportunity, getting knocked down time and time again, but also always moving forward. So with JHC's partnership, on Veterans Day last year, the Japan Society brought the story of Koho Yamamoto and Tak Furumoto. Tak was born in Tule Lake. While his parents were incarcerated there, his grandparents were victims of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. After being released from the camps, he went to live in Hiroshima, but he returned to the US, and he served in Vietnam as an American citizen, awarded the Bronze Star, overcame PTSD, and became a community leader in this area. There were 120,000 stories then, far more including those that suffered outside the direct mass incarceration. We are honored to have this partnership with the J Heritage Center to welcome our distinguished speakers so that we learn more about this difficult, complicated time. Our objective is to explore the opportunity to learn more and move forward as a community together. So thank you for coming, and we'll have Yoshi will introduce us, or speakers.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everyone. I am Yoshi Eito. I'm director of the Japan Society of Fairfield County, and it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Grant Ujifusa is a third-generation Japanese American who grew up in Wyoming, in northern Wyoming, in a beet farm and barley farm in northern Wyoming. He was also the star quarterback of his football team at the local high school. Very important part of his bio. Grant graduated Harvard class of '65. He was a book editor for Houghton Mifflin and Random House. And at the same time, he was founding editor and co-author of the Almanac of Un-American Politics. That was known as the Bible of American politics. And let's just say that everybody who was featured in that book would pick up the phone if Grant was calling. So that was a very useful tool for our community. During the 1980s, Grant was Redress Strategy Chair for the Japanese American Citizens League, and he was instrumental in reverting Ronald Reagan's opposition to the Japanese American Reparations Act, known as House Resolution 442. And for this, and for not just enacting, but funding the bill, the Japanese government granted him the Order of the Rising Sun. So we're very happy to have you here tonight, Grant, and please help us, please welcome Grant Ujifusa.
Thank you very much, Yoshi. I'm so pleased to be here among some, if not many, familiar faces. I was very pleased this morning, this afternoon, to be picked up and led around and lunched with Vernon and Nancy Beck. I want to thank them. I also want to thank Suzanne Clary and Jackie Alexander for making our time together today possible. And a special thanks to my friend of many, many years, Yoshi Ito, for inviting me to speak to you today. I'd like to talk about two things this afternoon. First, why I think Franklin Roosevelt, perhaps the most liberal president of the 20th century, issued Executive Order 9066. And second, why Ronald Reagan, perhaps the most conservative president of the 20th century, signed the Japanese American Redress Bill H.R. 442 on August 10th, 1988. This he did after Mr. Reagan himself and his administration had publicly opposed the bill for almost 2 years. That Reagan signed our bill might make you think that the experience of prison camps had a happy ending of a conventional sort. Not entirely, no, not at all. Most Japanese Americans in these camps had lost everything, which meant that some Nisei who aspired to become mechanical engineers spent their lives as garage mechanics. Flawed like other human beings, Americans must be careful when they say they live and always have lived in a city shining on a hill. Tragedy is also part of life in that place. So the question for us today is, why were 120,000 perfectly ordinary Asian Americans stripped of their rights and dignity, then given 36 hours to abandon their homes, work, and school, and then be escorted by the United States Army to 10 prison camps in the country's desolate, sometimes swampy interior? My view is perhaps to the left and harsher than the judgment reached by the commission looking into the camps in its 1982 report, Personal Justice Denied. Namely, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. For me, the political failure was not, as the last term might imply, one of passive omission, but one of active commission. Franklin Roosevelt was not asleep at the White House switch only to find one sweet morning that tar paper barracks were going up at Hart Mountain. Only the President of the United States could decide to sign EO 9066, and that he affirmatively did. Excuse me, I have a non-transmissible condition called fibrosis, which leads me to cough, but none of you should worry. So why did he sign? First, FDR knew that competition in the truck farming business had for many years fed racial bigotry of a politically potent variety on the West Coast. As one white farmer put it, the Japs came here to work, and they stayed to take over. By 1940, Japanese Americans controlled 30% of the local fruit and vegetable market in California. This was something substantial that we had built, that was ours, that others wanted. So first, it was about the money. You know, follow the money. And you know, when they say it's not about the money, it's about the money. Second, the camps were the final installment of bigotry and political calculation of the usual sort. To put a brutal point on it, from the time just after the gold rush, the Shinks and the Japs to come later were the N-word plural of the West Coast. So it was simply good politics to run against the Japs. Just as it is in the American South, it was, and usually still is, good politics to run against the N-word plural. And FDR was a gifted politician, a genius at manipulation, and enjoyed near unanimous support from the immigration restrictionist labor unions and the small land-grabbing and left-leaning members of the Grange. In 1942, FDR was looking for an unprecedented fourth term in 1944, and he knew that for many white voters on the West Coast, imprisonment of the Japs was almost as good as sending the foreigners back to their own country. Third, and my most important point this afternoon, after Pearl Harbor, mass and elite opinion, both hysterical about the Japanese army poised to invade Long Beach, came together on what needed to be done. If there was no time or way to separate the loyal from the disloyal, the only answer was mass incarceration. Among the most bigoted figures in the drama was Army General John DeWitt, deputized by Franklin Roosevelt to make the decision to remove the spies and then to remove them physically. In his report to the president, DeWitt wrote, quote, "In the war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by immigration. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and the racial strain is undiluted. Along the vital West Coast, over 100,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. There are indications that they are organized and ready for concerted action at a favorable opportunity." Now here comes the good part. The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken. That's just how sneaky these people are. Among the, excuse me for a moment. Among the elite policymakers who agreed with DeWitt's assessment was, of course, FDR himself, with some misgivings, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a true WASP Brahmin. Then there was Assistant Secretary John J. McCloy, who grew up poor in Philadelphia, who then later okayed Mike Masaoka's idea for the creation of the 442, and who then, after the war, rose to become what was called the chairman of the American establishment. That establishment was the old one, based inside the New York banks and the old line law firms. Not so much anymore. Then there was, famously, California Attorney General Earl Warren, who wanted to be elected governor of California in 1944 and was. Would he have been elected had he opposed the camps? I don't think so. Then there were the shapers and reflectors of mass opinion. Walter Winchell, an often rabble-rousing radio commentator, a little bit like maybe Rush Limbaugh. The infamous William Randolph Hearst of the nation's tabloids. Worse yet, V.S. McClatchy of the McClatchy chain of papers in the Central Valley, and then the somewhat less virulent Los Angeles Times, owned by the Chandler family, and the San Francisco Chronicle, owned by the DeYoung family. The shapers of mass opinion, which included Time magazine, were later joined by Walter Lippmann of the New York Herald Tribune. The esteemed and elite Lippmann delivered perhaps the cruelest and also the decisive blow. Then there was Edward R. Murrow, famously of CBS Radio. These two men, the country's elites, took their cues. Finally, in a small corner of elite opinion, there was Harold Ross of the now fashionably progressive New Yorker magazine. And oddly, an ardent young Stalinist who was later to become Dr. Seuss. Not many disagreed with General DeWitt, but among them were J. Edgar Hoover, who felt correctly that only a few of the Japanese Americans needed to be watched. And there was, on the good guy side, the always valiant American Friends Service Committee and the great Eleanor Roosevelt, who, I might add here, suggested to her husband that they adopt a Nisei couple so they wouldn't have to go to camp. Sadly, Roger Baldwin of the ACLU chose to sit on his hands. He had a couple of fellow travelers on his board, and Stalin got the word out that he liked the idea of the camps because Japan was a Soviet enemy in East Asia. Now, here's my thesis. When mass and elite opinion makers converge on something very bad will happen. They did in 1942. Today, it seems to me unlikely that they will converge about, let's say, the Muslims and the Latinos and other minorities in American life, views advocated by Donald J. Trump. He is, as you know, a spokesman for a notable segment of mass opinion. But as we also know, elite opinion furiously opposes him on just about everything. And so it may be that the camps of 42 have had a lasting immunizing effect on the politics and conscience of our country, one especially powerful on our nation's educated elite. In my reading of our history, elite versus mass opinion sometimes creates another form of check and balance in our system. Now I'd like to tell you the story, which some of you heard, about how President Ronald Reagan, who for 2 years was publicly opposed to our bill, came to sign H.R. 442 on August 10, 1988. The hero of our story is Kaz Masuda of Fountain Valley, California. This was a small town where Kaz grew up on a modest truck farm in then completely agricultural Orange County. They grew oranges in Orange County. On August 27, 1944, Kaz was killed in action on the banks of the Arno River in Italy while serving as a member of the 442. Sergeant Masuda was 24 years old and was to be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Already in the Army when the war broke out, Kaz volunteered for service in the 442. From Camp Shelby in Mississippi, he would visit his mother and father and his sisters Mary and June, who were living not far away in the Jerome, Arkansas prison camp. Kaz said to Mary that if anything happened to him, he wanted to be buried in his hometown cemetery back in Fountain Valley. After Mary learned that Kaz had been killed, she received permission to leave the internment camp. This was in Arkansas. They were transferred to Topaz. Leave the internment camp for Fountain Valley, where she went to City Hall to make arrangements for her brother. But the town fathers there said to Mary, "We're sorry, miss, but we don't bury Japs in our cemetery." Somehow word got to General Vinegar Joe Stilwell at the Pentagon. In the China-India Theater, Stilwell was a commanding officer of Colonel Frank Merwell of Merwell's Marauders, a group of 2,700 men, including 15 Japanese Americans of the Military Intelligence Service, the MIS, who could read, write, understand, and speak Japanese. All of the men, all of them volunteers, fought and died and distinguished themselves behind enemy lines in Burma. For a year, Merrill's Marauders tied down an entire Japanese division. The Marauders suffered an 85% casualty rate, when 15% is considered astronomical. Vinegar Joe respected, even loved, the Japanese American soldier. So he got himself to Orange County and confronted the town fathers. The general said, "This soldier is going to be buried here, and I'm going to make an example of you SOBs and make a big deal of it. I'm going to present Kaz Masuda's mother the Distinguished Service Cross at a ceremony at Santa Ana Bowl." The town fathers backed off. Invited to speak by Stilwell at the ceremony was a 26-year-old movie star, then an FDR Democrat. 26-year-old movie star was someone named Army Captain Ronald Reagan. But there was a big problem. Kaz, his mother, refused to accept the medal. What she felt, this is my presumption here, was this. They push us off our farm into a scary camp next to a swamp. Then they take my son, excuse me, then they take my son, and he comes back in a bottle, in a box. And they want to give me a medal? No, thank you. But an Army general, General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, is coming to present the medal to her, Mary said. I don't care who he is, Mrs. Masuda said. No, thank you. Finally, it was arranged for Mary to accept the medal. After Stilwell spoke, Ronald Reagan got up and said, "The blood that is soaked into the sand is all one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on a way, an ideal. Not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background, we have all the strength in the world. That is the American way. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, just as one member of the family of Americans speaking to another member, I want to say for what your son Kazuo did, thank you." Excuse me. Many Japanese Americans knew that Captain Reagan spoke at Kaz's ceremony. But how could we get word into President Reagan to remind him of what he did and said in 1945, and perhaps nudge him toward changing his mind about our bill? I asked Bill Bennett, someone I used to play touch football with in college, to help. Then Ed Rollins, a nice man, Reagan's campaign manager, and then a brilliant economist, once at Berkeley, and a fine Mormon, Richard Worthland, Reagan's pollster, to help. None of them could do anything. After a meeting in the White House, Worthland called me and said that the top aides around Reagan were dead set against us. Worthland suggested we hold off for a session of Congress. I said we couldn't. We'd been working for more than 10 years, and we were running out of gas. The people who controlled the legislation were Ed Meese and his good friend, S.I. Hayakawa, known to both Reagan and Meese as Sam. It was Sam's assertion that the only people who wanted redress were the radicals on the left who held street demonstrations and got on local TV. These are the people that he pulled the plug on, or kind of people he pulled the plug on in his famous San Francisco state stunt. At the same time, in the summer of '87, I was a book editor in New York, and one of my writers was, by complete chance, Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey. I turned to him for help. Tom said that the president was coming to New Jersey to campaign for state legislative candidates in October of 1987. The governor said he would bring up redress with the president as they traveled around the state in helicopters and limousines. With him was Ken Duberstein, Reagan's chief of staff at that time, and one brilliant fellow. In any case, Reagan said to Tom that he thought Japanese Americans were sent to camp for protective custody. This was Meese and Hayakawa's line. Tom said to the president, "No, it wasn't that." The next day, Tom called me and said, "Write me a letter speaking to that point and I'll get it to the president using a special line of access called the pouch. This was a line of access for Republican governors all over the country. I said, I can also get a letter from Kaz Masuda's sister, June, saying, please sign H.R. 442. Tom said, I'll get her letter into him too. June Masuda Goto wrote, Dear Mr. President, thank you for taking the time to read my letter. Perhaps you recall a very special day for our family, December 9, 1945, when you came to a ceremony honoring my brother, Kaz Masuda, in Santa Ana, California. The presence of you and General Stilwell greatly affected the community and led to a better life for our family. For example, many times I have been asked to speak at the Kazuo Masuda Middle School. I speak to all the history classes and quote your words to students. If the legislation comes to you, I hope you will look upon it favorably. Reagan read June's letter, called Governor Kean, and he said, I remember that day at the ceremony for Kaz Masuda. I think redress is something I might want to do. He then called Ken Duberstein and said, hold everything. After the president signed our bill, June Masuda Goto was led up to the podium in a photo captured by the New York Times, front page the next day, led up to the podium to meet him. The president leaned down toward her and asked, are you Mary? June answered, no, Mary is dead. I'm her sister, June. Excuse me. Long ago, a Buddhist priest served our family while I was growing up. He once said, where there is gratitude, there also is civilization. As we're here together this afternoon, I think we can be grateful to Kaz Masuda for his heroism on the battlefield, and grateful for Kaz's mother for her defiance of authority of the most imposing kind, and to Kaz's sister for acceptance of life as it is and finally has to be. And grateful finally to General Stilwell for going the last mile to honor a fellow soldier. We are the beneficiaries of the civilization that these four Americans helped to create. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Grant, for those remarks. And thanks. Now we have the fortune of having Grant join in conversation by University of Pennsylvania's constitutional law professor Kermit Roosevelt III. He's considered to be the top scholar in the constitutional aspects of internment. So Kim and Grant will examine the politics behind getting redress done. So please welcome Kim Roosevelt.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much to the J Heritage Center and the Japan Society for organizing this. It's really an honor for me to be here. I thank Grant also for attending. It's a real honor to be here with you. Well, so I thought I was riveted while you were talking. Some of this I've heard before. I've heard you speak. The story in the latter part of it I really hadn't heard before. But I think that maybe a lot of people here are interested, and I'm certainly interested in knowing a little bit more about your story. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the redress movement?
Sure, thank you. When I was growing up in northern Wyoming, 65 miles as a crow flies from Hart Mountain. In fact, my grandfather used to joke with me. I was bilingual until I was maybe 8. And Grandpa would say, Masashi-san, you have to be very careful in life because you come from a really stupid family. And I said, well, Grandpa, well, why would you say something like that? And Grandpa said, because I voluntarily chose to settle a part of the world to which 12,000 people were involuntarily removed. So this was northern Wyoming. And one of the figures who would come to visit us on his way to Yellowstone Park was Minya Sui, his wife True, and their 4 daughters, all named after flowers, Holly, Laurel, I forget the other 2. And they would spend time with us at our farmhouse and then visit the natural wonders of Yellowstone. So after many years, Min approached me in New York and said, well, why don't you join our effort? You have this book, blah, blah, blah. And I said, man, why are you doing this? I mean, you're an old man. This is hopeless. He said, it's something I have to do. So they had a commissioning hearing in New York. And so I took the subway down to hear this. And here were these stoic Issei men in their 70s and 80s. Some were Nisseis. And they were crying in public. These are Japanese men. They don't do that, nor do Japanese women. So I said, I can't stand this anymore. I called men. And then I had breakfast with Mike Masok in Washington and said I would do what I could to help. So Min got me in because he was an old family friend who used to visit Yellowstone Park.
Thank you. Maybe pivoting to a slightly bigger topic, I guess the big question that I have as a constitutional law professor, as someone who's interested in American history and American identity, is really sort of how we should think about this. And obviously, I think there's no right answer, there's no single answer. But on the question of how this episode fits into the story of America and what themes it brings up and what it should make us think about our past and our future and the sort of the nature of the American story, I know you said it's not a conventional happy ending, in that absolutely, like, the redress that comes is completely inadequate compared to the scale of the harm that was inflicted. But I wonder, what we should think, what lessons you think we should take from the whole story, starting with the detention and then moving up to the redress movement and then eventually the signing of the bill. what's the takeaway? I know it's a big question, but.
Well, my answer is sort of simple and simple-minded. The country cannot, in extreme situations or in situations not so extreme, become racist. And we all know, I think, what that is and what that feels like. And I think in our public life today, there's quite a bit of it. And the lesson is that inclination, which I think all of us sometimes possess, should be furiously resisted.
Yes. And do you think that this has made us better able to resist? So one of the things you said is that to some extent maybe this sad chapter in American history has immunized us going forward. And it's sort of very interesting to digress into constitutional law for a moment. Because in the Korematsu decision, where the Supreme Court ends up upholding the removal of the Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Now, interestingly, the Korematsu decision, this is a common misconception, it's not about the detention. In Korematsu, the Supreme Court does not say detention is okay. They say removal is okay. And then when they get to detention, in another case called Ex parte Endo, they actually say it's not okay. They say without individualized proof of disloyalty, you cannot detain American citizens. And then they go on, somewhat unconvincingly, to blame the whole thing on the War Department. So you were talking about the desire to exculpate FDR. And the Supreme Court, which of course is 8 Roosevelt appointees, is trying to do that too. They say, oh, the government, the president didn't ever authorize this. The War Relocation Authority sort of went rogue, and that's why we have these camps. Totally untrue. The Solicitor General of the United States actually said that at the oral argument. He said, let there be no mistake about what the government has done. This is our responsibility. If you think it's wrong, you need to say that. The court didn't do it. But in the Korematsu decision, the justices were sort of struggling with this. They didn't want to go against Roosevelt. They didn't want to undermine the war effort, although by the time the decision comes down, it's very clear there's no threat. But they're thinking about what to do going forward. And that, I think, is in part one reason why they decide Korematsu and Endo on the same day. They're trying to say, well, in time of war, some things might be necessary, but we're also standing up for the rights of American citizens. Didn't work, of course. Everyone forgot Endo. Korematsu is the one that they remembered. But one of the most memorable passages in the Korematsu opinion is from a dissent by Justice Robert Jackson, where he says, we can't do this because this decision will lie around like a loaded gun. And the next time there's an attack, the next time Americans get scared, the next time they fix their fears on some group of people who look different. And this, I think, is the pattern that happens again and again, right? Americans, we're safe behind our oceans. We're not used to being attacked. We get scared. So Pearl Harbor, 9/11, things like that. We get very scared. We fix our fears on people that we think aren't real Americans who might be dangerous, even though they're citizens. And Justice Jackson was saying this makes it more likely that this will happen again. And yet, the actual doctrine that the majority announces in Korematsu, Justice Black, says all racial classifications that curtail the civil rights of a single group are immediately suspect and must be subjected to the most stringent scrutiny. And that's the first time the Supreme Court has ever said that about racial classifications. And that, in some ways, is the birth of this idea that the Supreme Court needs to look more closely at racial classifications. So in terms of the law, it actually sets up a rule that ends up giving you cases like Brown v. Board of Education and Loving against Virginia and the Warren Court decisions that strike down racial classifications. Now, the court didn't apply the scrutiny really in that case because it didn't subject the government's justifications to much of a testing inquiry. But I think the Supreme Court also learned from that experience too. So institutionally, the Supreme Court ended up thinking, I know that Justice Souter thought this because I talked about it with him. The Supreme Court ended up thinking that it had been mistaken to take the executive's word for it, that there was a real threat, that it was impossible to separate the loyal from the disloyal people, because all of that turned out to be a lie. And it turned out that some lawyers in the Justice Department knew it was a lie, and some people were putting the story forward anyway, and some people were trying to get the justices to pay more attention. But so in many ways, the Korematsu decision and the litigation did, I think, strengthen our system against that going forward. Although I should say there's also sort of a sad coda to that, which is that if you look at recent decisions about racial classifications, there is this sort of great moment with the second Reconstruction, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, where the court is dismantling oppressive racial classifications. But almost all of the cases about racial classifications for the past 30 to 40 years have actually been attacks on affirmative action. And so now the Supreme Court is invoking this line about how racial classifications are suspect for slightly different political purposes, right? It's not tearing down oppressive classifications so much as it's tearing down attempts to promote equality, and people have different views about that. But I wonder, that's sort of a long digression about how it's all worked out in constitutional law. But I wonder if you think that it does help us going forward to avoid things like this.
I think that it does, and there are high school texts now that include the story of how the Japanese Americans were removed from their lives on the West Coast and put in these camps, and so I think that's all to the good. But I am not a psychologist. I'm not an anthropologist. It is rather fearsome and scary and unimaginable when racism emerges full-blown in our public life today. And it has. So whether it will go to an extreme, which is to set up 10 camps to which we send these undesirable people, is probably not going to happen, but it does seem to be just below the surface of our public life, and we should all be attentive to that. There is a lesson in the Japanese American experience, which I think is useful to us.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation anymore, so we do have some time for questions. So if there's anyone in the audience.
How come in this story they never talk about who benefited from when these Japanese were put into the camps? When these American citizens were put into the camps, their property was taken away. Who were the ones who got who were the ones who got their property? Who was the ones who got their belongings? How come in this story I never hear that?
I think that's an interesting question, and the story varies. If I were a Japanese American farmer in outside of Fresno, let's say, where the Japanese farmers in short order began to dominate agriculture in places like Fresno and the Central Valley. I could have, in the best instance, said to you, a neighboring farmer, please take care of my property while I'm gone. You can harvest all the crops that grow on it. Make sure you pay taxes on it. And I think I might return someday. Mostly that didn't happen. And these properties were sold at fire sale prices, which was part of the political plan. Why are these Japs doing so well here? They're doing better than I am. Now we have this opportunity to do something about that. And they did, and for the most part, farmers in the Central Valley and other places, as productive as farmers, lost everything. They lost everything when their Issei, or first generation parents, were aliens, ineligible for citizenship. And for that reason, legally unable to own land in California, Washington, Oregon. And those who had accumulated some property turned it over in name to their Nisei children, and so became property owners, many of them for not very long, when the entire family was, let's say, moved to Heart Mountain. So a lot of it is, or was, about money. And as one of our great philosophers once put it, when they say it's not about the money, it's about the money. And that is, I'd say, half of what went on. There are other percentages that one might arbitrarily assign to what happened. Out and out racism, for one thing. You know, Central Valley of California was one of the most productive farmlands anywhere in the world. And also after the war, when we had lost the property, some of that land was developed commercially for millions upon millions of dollars. And so that never came our way.
Oh, thanks. You mentioned briefly the fear, hysteria, let's call it, right after 9/11. Could you expand on a little bit more on how the 9/11 Muslim hysteria related to this and how it didn't relate? I mean, it didn't seem as extreme, perhaps?
Well, yes. So, I mean, in some ways, it's not as extreme. In some ways, I think it's more extreme. One of the things that happens after Korematsu, I think, is that we start taking American citizenship more seriously. So, over and over again, in the World War II episode, there's this complete inability to keep race and citizenship separate. So after Pearl Harbor, the loyal, outraged Japanese Americans go to the enlistment centers, right? This happens around the country. It's happening on the West Coast. Japanese Americans are showing up saying, I want to enlist. And they get turned away. People say, you're an enemy alien, right? You can't serve. After the Japanese Americans are detained in camps, the Army actually does start recruiting from the camps. and there's a US Army colonel touring the camps, talking to the people who volunteered, and he says, "I'm really proud of you that you've volunteered to fight for America and against your country." So like over and over again, people can't distinguish between race and citizenship, and that's one way of sort of understanding the problem that's going on there, that race is being considered more significant. And you know, in some ways, that's a very American thing, because the Supreme Court told us 7-2 in 1858 that there's a racial line around the American political community, and black people can never be US citizens. And we've sort of slowly been trying to work past that birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, which is why the second generation of Japanese Americans are citizens, right, is a big part of that. But you can see in the 1940s it hasn't really taken hold. In the 2000s, I think it has, because we're attacked on September 11th, and there is this hysteria that goes around, and the government starts trying to get the people who are responsible. And one of the things that the government sometimes does in situations like this, I think to reassure people, to like let you know we're on the job, we're striking back at the people who hurt you. In World War II, that's like the Doolittle raid, where we're like, yes, we're hitting Japan. And also, I think in part, it's the detention of Japanese Americans, because they look like the enemy to the general American public. And the general American public is reassured when you see lines of Japanese Americans in front of soldiers with bayonets being put on trains. It's like, okay, the government's keeping us safe. So the same thing happens after 9/11. You know, we want the people who did this, and if we can't get them, we'll settle for people who are close enough to stand in for them, who look like them. So they start dropping leaflets all around Afghanistan saying, turn over the terrorists. And they get some terrorists, and they get some foreign aid workers, and they get some people that other people are having feuds with, and they send them all to Guantanamo, and they march them off the planes in orange jumpsuits. And again, the American public is reassured because it looks like these are the bad guys and we've got them and we're dealing with them, even though, again, a lot of them had nothing to do with it. And Guantanamo is like really bad. So like now you've got a lot of people who sort of look appropriate, even though some of them, most of them, it turns out, had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. And you're trying to get information out of them. And this is almost a parallel to the like, no sabotage has occurred. That shows they're planning a coordinated strike. A lot of people are like, gosh, I have no information to give you. And they're like, aha, you are resisting our interrogation. We must use more aggressive methods. So they escalate. And then they start getting information, because you know, you put enough pressure on people, they'll tell you things. And they implicate other people, but of course, most of what they're saying is just made up. It's a terrible situation. But that doesn't quite happen to the American citizens. So there are a couple of American citizens who get swept up in this. But generally speaking, the government understands they're American citizens and they have rights. So they don't get held in Guantanamo. They get taken to the United States and put in military brigs. And they're not quite tortured in the same way, although the government does say some really chilling and terrifying things about this. So when they're holding Jose Padilla and they're saying we can't give him access to a lawyer, his court-appointed representative says, okay, you know, why can't you give him access to a lawyer? And the government responds, successful interrogation relies on the creation of a relationship and trust and dependence. And getting a lawyer involved in there is going to really interfere with the rapport that we're trying to build, basically because we need this person to feel completely helpless. And if you let him talk to a lawyer, he will feel hope that maybe he can win release through the judicial process, and that sets back our interrogation efforts enormously. And when I teach this case, I tell my students, that's what you do as a lawyer, right? You give people hope. But we do treat the US citizens differently. And I think that maybe that's a step forward. But on the whole, I feel like there's still this pattern, right? That America gets attacked, Americans get scared, we put our fears on people who are not necessarily the right people, and then if you have the bad actors out there who are trying to push this along for their own profit, it can sort of spiral out of control if the harm is being done to people that America in general doesn't care about. And if you don't have enough people who are willing to stand up for them. And that definitely happens with the Guantanamo detainees. It's smaller scale, they're not American citizens, and there's not as much profit, but there is a little bit of profit. So there are these psychologists who design an interrogation program that they sell to the CIA, and they make millions of dollars off of it. And we go forward with this interrogation program, which weirdly enough is modeled by sort of reverse engineering training that US service members have to go through, which is supposed to teach them to resist the interrogation techniques of countries like North Korea, right? So that's sort of what we're now modeling our interrogation program on. And people seem to have forgotten that the whole point of the North Korean interrogation program is to get false confessions. So psychologists make millions of dollars selling the US government an interrogation program that is basically designed to produce bad information. Yes, so it's about the money.
But I think you left out part of it is, I mean, when 9/11 happened, there were people who were celebrating that. People who were literally like in Patterson, New Jersey, you had people out in the streets celebrating that until they had put a big sign up that says, "We're for America." And you had people in other places in the world who were celebrating it.
Well, so I think like around the world, the immediate reaction is a somewhat surprising outpouring of sympathy.
There was a lot.
Right, so there are candlelight vigils in Tehran.
There was both, but there were also people, I mean, remember, we also, I mean, it's a tough one because first of all, should American citizens be treated differently in our own country? I say yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
All right,
so
so
sure.
we have another question back here.
Yes. First of all, Grant, I'd like to thank you for creating the, what I call the baseball encyclopedia for nerds, the Almanac of American Politics. And if I thought of it, I would have brought my 1972 issue over for you to autograph. I wish I thought of that.
It's worth some money now.
Like a Mickey Mantle baseball card, maybe. But
Me for that.
yeah, thank you.
Anyway.
Thank you. But it's a serious question, Grant. I noticed you were born on January 4th, 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor. All of us who are parents remember the last month before our children were born, how nervous and concerned we were. Could you share some of your parents' feelings, how they were the last month of your mom's pregnancy with you coming right after Pearl Harbor?
Well, I don't have any direct memories.
Please use the microphone.
I'm sorry. I don't have any direct memories circa January 4th, 1942. But I will say that there was less apprehension where I was born, which is to say in northern Wyoming, coincidentally 90 miles from perhaps the most well-known internment, quote, prison camp, Hart Mountain. In that, in this small, among the last to be settled part of the continental United States, there were substantial numbers of very nice people from Iowa. And their response to all this was Sam. That was my grandfather's American name. His Japanese name was Shuichi. Sam's not a spy. He was here 20 years before we were. And so we escaped some of the direct impact of Pearl Harbor. And then, not long after that initial experience, the government, in their wisdom, decided to build Hart Mountain, perhaps the most famous of the internment camps. And some of my earliest memories are from internees, as they're now euphemistically called, coming down 65 miles to our sugar beet farm to help us with our sugar beet crop. There was a huge shortage of labor at that point. And I can remember one internee in particular from Tacoma, I later learned, named Joe Furuta. And Joe and I became really good friends. And he would carry me around on his back. We had a very fine time of it. And as I grew older, one thing that happened to me was I'm in the redress fight for Joe. They did this to Joe. So, you know, I think that the experience of internment was confined to Japanese Americans living within 125 miles of the Pacific Ocean, which encompassed 97% of all Japanese Americans. We were among the 3% who lived in the wilds of Wyoming and escaped that horror. And I think as a result of that, and I'm serious about this, I'm a very healthy ex-Worland, Wyoming quarterback. Almost made All-State. So we were among the lucky ones, and I felt, perhaps incorrectly, that, and this is a very broad statement, not entirely justified, but they didn't give me a bad time in Worland. I think the whites didn't give me such a bad time in Worland, Wyoming, 65 miles from Hart Mountain. I think I can make, with a little help from Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey, make redress work. And then we got people like the brilliant Barney Frank pushing it through the House. And then we got Ronald Reagan remembering what had happened when he came to speak at Kaz Masuda's event in Fountain Valley. So the answer is we needed all 6 numbers on the lotto code, or on the lotto card. You know what? We got all 6 of them.
There's a question here.
Hi, just a quick question. Did any of the members who were interned try to go back to their farms or their houses or their place of employment to get back what was theirs?
Yes. There were some farmers, let's say around Fresno. Fresno was not a very happy place in 1942 for Japanese Americans. But we had some very dear friends who were often neighbors. And they said, listen, I don't understand what's going on, but you're going to have to leave. And while you're away, I'll take care of your farm. And we'll raise, what do they raise in Fresno? Pistachio nuts on your farm. And what we'll do with those pistachio nut sales is we'll pay your taxes and you won't lose your farm. And so there are some very few Japanese American farmers who came back to Fresno mostly whole, but I would say 97, 98% did not. They lost everything.
There's a question.
Hi, this is a question for either of you. I recall seeing in a history book not too long ago that the FDR administration considered similar internment camps for Italian Americans and German Americans, but withdrew the idea as it became just quite impossible. I was wondering if either of you recall any of this and whether you could comment.
So I don't think that they did seriously consider the same kind of detention camps. And actually, so one thing that I learned while I was researching the detention was detention wasn't actually part of the plan initially. And none of the people who are really pushing for removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast actually want detention that much. It's not really part of their list of goals. So you've got sort of the hysterical, incompetent people in the military who really do sincerely, and it's because they're racist, but they do sincerely think there's a military threat. They want the Japanese Americans removed from the West Coast to eliminate this perceived threat. There's the Salinas Fruit Growers Association, who are concerned about economic competition. They want the Japanese Americans removed, but they don't care about camps. There's the Native Sons of the Golden West, who are this sort of California version of the Klan. They just want to make California white. They also don't really care about detention. Why does detention happen? It's because the interior states won't accept the Japanese Americans. And this sort of throws the whole thing into really sharp relief for me. It's sort of an illustration of the ways in which America failed, because the official line is, of course, we understand that most of these people are loyal, but there is a disloyal element and we can't readily identify them, and therefore everyone has to leave, and we know this is a sacrifice, but this is how you can show what a patriotic American you are, right? Leave your home, leave your business, leave your school, lose all your property. That's the sacrifice that America is demanding of you. And now people turn to the citizens of the interior states and they're like, hey, here are these displaced Americans who are loyal, and do you think maybe you could accommodate them and help them because they've been forced to leave their home? And the governor of Wyoming, I think it is, says, if you try to come here, there will be Japs hanging from every pine tree. And that's why they end up Cottonwood tree. And so that's why they end up building the camps. So what I was saying was, I don't think that there was any sort of detention program that was similar contemplated. There was, a sort of supervision in some cases of the actual aliens, so people who are not US citizens. There was not similar treatment of Italian Americans and German Americans. One of the sort of poignant things about this, and like there's so many amazing stories, but one of the sort of poignant things is Fred Korematsu, whose case goes to the Supreme Court. Why does he end up litigating this? How does he end up getting caught up in the machinery of justice in this way? Well, Gordon Hirabayashi actually goes there on purpose. He's a test case. He violates the curfew. He's walking up and down the street trying to get arrested, and no one arrests him. And then he calls up the police department. He calls the FBI, and he's like, there's a Japanese man walking up and down the street. And they say, mind your own business, right, to their credit. He has to walk into the police department and say, I'm violating the curfew, arrest me, which he does because he thinks this violates the Constitution, and he believes that patriotism demands that he stand up for the Constitution. Fred Korematsu is actually different. Fred Korematsu wants to stay in the exclusion zone because he's got an Italian-American fiancée, Ida Boitano. So, like, he's Japanese-American, she's Italian-American, he has to leave, she doesn't. It's sort of a nice love story, except that then she turns on him, which is sad. And there are, like, FBI notes of interviews with her where she's like, they say she was planning to marry him, but now she realizes she made a mistake and that's impossible. It's actually very sad. So the takeaway from all of that, I guess, is race. It's about race. Because you could say pretty much all of the things that they said about the threat posed by the Japanese American communities, about the Germans on the East Coast, where submarines are sinking our merchant vessels every night. The situation is worse. And what about the fear that, Nazis will come and blend into the civilian population? They talked about that, like it's going to happen on the Japanese. It happens with Germans on the East Coast. Yeah, Nazi saboteurs land. They blend into the population. They never manage to carry out their mission because 2 of them turn in the rest. The U.S. government is like, we caught the saboteurs. They don't tell you that they caught them because 2 of them turned in the others. But it really happened with the Germans. And of course, we don't get that kind of response. And we have Eisenhower, right, a German American who's commanding our armed forces. So the racial dimension, it comes out very strongly when you contrast the treatment of Italians and Germans to the treatment of Japanese.
There are also too many Germans and Italians to handle. You have to send half the population of Cincinnati to camp.
Please use the microphone.
You'd have to send half. There are too many Italian and German Americans to handle. You'd have to send half the population of Germanic Cincinnati to camp. And I think they had, some German Americans arrived after the failure of the revolutions in Germany in 1848. So they had been around for a long time. And no politician is going to say, let's send all the Germans to an internment camp. Or for that matter, take a city like Jersey City in Jersey, which is still heavily Italian American. You're not going to get politicians to say, we're sending Mussolini sympathizers to camp. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was, I don't know, it's hard to speculate, counterfactual history. But after the attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, then not a state, but regarded as such by most Americans, after that attack, it was almost, and this is speculation, almost inevitable that what happened. Lots of competition. California truck farming in particular. And my question for you is, you're a Jap. Why should you be making all that money? I mean, you're a foreigner. So I think, as Marx might have put it, and I'm not a Marxist, fair amount of what happened because of the desirability of California farmland and Japanese American, I would have to call it dominance in that part of our economy.
Yeah, we have time for 2 more questions, and there's one.
I may have my facts wrong, but I think the actual amount of the reparations was only $20,000.
That's correct.
Payable only to detainees who were still alive in 1988. And I was curious as to how those parameters were determined and whether part of the concern was setting precedents for other potential arguments about reparations.
That's correct. And there was an argument conducted really by someone for whom we owe House passage and more, who helped make that decision, namely the brilliant Barney Frank. And the question was, look, if we give this money to you, what's going to happen when all the blacks and the Hispanics and others show up? We can't have that precedent. And so the answer was you had to be a direct victim of the camp. You could have been 2 weeks old, but in camp, and you were eligible. If you were born 2 weeks after the camps were officially closed, you were ineligible. In any case, you had to be a direct victim of the camps. And so that cut down the possibility that Native Americans and blacks and Hispanics could make claims. Some were still made, but unsuccessfully. I happened to be part of that negotiation, and when Barney said, let's do it this way, I said, okay.
Okay, there's a couple more questions here. Oh.
So, Professor, when I saw you, I think 10 years ago at the FDR Library on Day of Remembrance, I was thinking, this could never happen. But a lot of things have happened in the last 10 years. And I see with the two presidents, our two most recent presidents, how different things are with different administrations and the same laws. And I'll tell you, now I'm not so sure that it couldn't happen to American citizens again. And I see it as the latitude that the executive branch has in selective enforcement of the law and selective prosecution of the law, either by prosecuting certain groups or failing to prosecute certain groups. And I just see that that citizens are at risk, and I don't see where the courts have much power over selective enforcement or selective prosecution. They seem to have power over just specific cases and whether the law was applied to that case.
Yeah, so I think, I agree with that to a large extent. Justice Scalia at one point, I think, was asked about Korematsu and could it happen again? And he laughed, as he often does, and he said, of course it'll happen again, right? If we're in the same situation, that's what's going to happen, because that's the dynamic of American psychology. And if the government says this is necessary to save the nation and there's an existential threat, the courts won't stop them. And we had a little bit of a test on that with the post 9/11 cases, and the court wasn't quite as willing as a lot of people thought it would be to let the government do whatever they said was necessary. Various reasons for that. But on your broader point about selective enforcement and the inability of courts to stop that, I think that's very true. The courts can look at a program, and if the program says all people of Japanese descent are to be confined in camps, the court understands how to look at that, and we've got rules in constitutional law about how you look at racial classifications, and they'll look at that pretty searchingly. And if the court says if the government says that all Muslim people are going to be put in camps, they'll look at that very searchingly. If what you've got is a sort of infiltration and surveillance program by the NYPD, and it's just going on as a matter of enforcement, and it's not in some law that the court can look at and say, here on its face is a racial or religious classification, then it's a lot harder. And of course, the NYPD did that. And selective prosecution on a racial basis, I would say you don't need a war, you don't need a national security emergency to make that happen. You can look at defendants and the kinds of sentences that they get and the kinds of distinctions that our criminal law makes between certain kinds of offenses that might seem very similar, but demographically they're committed by different populations, sort of the notorious powder crack cocaine disparities. And yeah, there's actually like a lot of racial selective enforcement, I think, in our criminal justice system right now.
But it's already happening with the Asian students who are being denied college entry in favor of the black students, whereas the Asian students are getting in on merit and the black students are not. And the Asian students are now putting forth a lawsuit saying judge on merit.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. But we have one last question here.
Thank you very much. It was so uplifting to listen to that. Although I liked Professor Roosevelt's remarks, and I had not known there are some positive kernels in the Korematsu decision. But in the light of the recent overturning of some civil rights by the Supreme Court, I wouldn't be able to rely on our current Supreme Court. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I'm not a fan of some of the recent Supreme Court decisions. And I guess I have two things to say about this. So one is, if you look at the broad sweep of American history, the Supreme Court does not do a good job of either implementing progressive policies or protecting unpopular minorities. Sometimes it looks like it's doing that, but that's typically when you've got a minority that's unpopular at a local level, and there's actually national sentiment that this group is being treated unfairly. And then the Supreme Court is pretty good at coming in and enforcing the will of a national majority against a state-level majority. And that's sort of the civil rights movement. That's the Warren Court. That's what happens if you think about race relations in black and white terms. There's a period where the Supreme Court looks really good. If you look at the broader sweep of history, the Supreme Court does not look very good, even on black-white relations. And then when you get to the rights of Asian Americans, it doesn't look so good either. So overall, the Supreme Court is not really a progressive force. It's more of a conservative force. And I think that's sort of by design, because if you think about the progressive movement that comes along with a new vision of justice, and let's be optimistic about America and say, we get better. So the progressive movement that comes along is a good movement. It can capture the House of Representatives very fast, right? Because they're up for election every 2 years. It can capture the presidency in 4 years at the most, because that's as long as you'll have to wait. The Senate takes longer because you've got staggered elections. But how long before this progressive movement captures the Supreme Court? Who knows, right? There's no regular way for a political movement to get input on who sits on the Supreme Court because we've got this system of lifetime tenure. So the Supreme Court tends to lag the other political branches by at least a little and sometimes a lot. And often the conflict that you get between the Supreme Court and other political branches, or the sense that you get that the Supreme Court is way out of step with mainstream public opinion, it's because there haven't been enough appointments recently, or because you get a president who's a one-term president, but then through some weird quirk, they get 3 appointments, whereas your prior 2-term presidents only got 2. And then the court looks like it's out of step with mainstream public opinion because it's been captured by a political party that represents a minority of America and doesn't win the popular vote more than 1 out of 8 times, and wins the presidency 3 out of the last 8 times, but still has this incredible majority on the Supreme Court because our appointment system is broken. And there is a solution to that, which is term limits. So if you let each president make 2 appointments per 4-year term, then you do ensure that the political movement that comes along with its great progressive vision can, in fact, capture the Supreme Court after some appropriate amount of time, after like 6 years, maybe.
When they decided on no term limits, was that this way the judges can't be corrupted. That was the original argument when the Supreme Court was being formed, is that they didn't want the judges to be influenced by public opinion.
Right. So I look forward to continuing that discussion during the reception. I'll only say there is no modern democracy in the world other than us that has life tenure, right? Every other country in the world thinks that a fixed, lengthy term is sufficient to preserve judicial independence. 18 years would be enough.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to our great speakers for telling us story. Thank you all for your questions. And please, let's continue the conversation over drinks just in the adjacent room. Thank you again.